So let's start off our discussion about communicating at the right speed by making it very clear that communication is not easy. It's hard to get it right, especially these days when you have employees spread out all over the place, not just all over the city, but all over the country. It's harder to connect and harder to communicate. And to prove my point, I want to use a mathematic theorem. This is called DeBruhl's theorem. It's used to connect complex numbers with trigonometry. And frankly, if you understand that, you're a better person than I. I'd have to admit, I know very little about math. But the thing I do know is that if you plug the same numbers into this formula over and over again, you get the same result. Now that's true in mathematics, but it's not true in communication. And here's a perfect example. Let's say you had a group of people that a year ago you put them in a room and they did a phenomenal job on a particular project. You know, they communicated, they collaborated, the results were spectacular. Get that same group of people together today. Now, first off, you can't put them in the same room, right? Now they're spread all over the place. And those people themselves may be just a little bit different than they were a year ago. Maybe somebody got married, had a child, somebody might have gotten a divorce or had money problems. Their focus is just a little bit different. What they bring into the virtual room now is a little different than what they brought into the real room 1 year ago. And while you plug the same numbers into the mathematic theorem over and over again, you get the same result. With communication, it's not that easy. And I want to show you some numbers that prove that point. 80% of the employees in one survey say they believe poor communication is the #1 cause of workplace stress. 63% say they want to quit because of poor workplace communication. And 52% said that poor communication is the primary cause of stress at work. Now, that's how it's affecting the employees themselves. Imagine how it's affecting the bottom line. I mean, if you have employees who are feeling stressed at work, they're not being effective. And there's research to show that stress and poor communication impacts the bottom line of any organization. So how do you fix that? What do you want to do to solve that problem? Well, I want to tell you a story about what can happen when communication works right. And I want to do it by talking about the Indy 500. Now, the Indy 500 is called the greatest spectacle in racing. It was first run in 1911. This guy right here, Ray Haroon, won that very first race. It took him 6 hours and 45 minutes to go 500 miles. Average speed of about 75 miles an hour. They were pounding over the bricks. It was really a brutal race back then. By the way, Ray Haroon is credited with inventing something that I'm hoping you use every day when you get in your car. If you look at about the midpoint on this car, just above that 32, there's a little thing and some spindly little legs. That's the very first recorded use of a rear view mirror on a car. Ray Haroon's credited with inventing it that day. Now, by the way, he said he couldn't see a darn thing with it. It bounced, it jiggles. But once again, he's the guy who gets credited for inventing it. Now, you probably don't remember Ray Haroon. I mean, after all, that was 100 years ago. But other people have gone on to become very famous. There's A.J. Foyt. He's won the race a record 4 times. Mario Andretti only won it once, but his name is synonymous with speed. And then there's this guy right here, Helio Castroneves. Helio Castroneves has won the race 3 times, and he's the only current race driver who could potentially win it a record 4th time, tie A.J. Foyt and some other drivers. By the way, how many of you know Helio Castroneves because he's won the Indianapolis 500 3 times? And how many of you know Helio Castroneves because he's won Dancing with the Stars? That's right, just shows that race car drivers are indeed true athletes, and some of them can dance. And there's one other player in our story that I'd like to introduce you to, and well, that's me. I spent most of the last 30 years covering auto racing for TV networks like ABC, ESPN, NBC, a variety of others, and then that particular day, I was part of the ABC broadcast team covering the Indy 500. I was a pit reporter. My job was to go up and down pit lane looking for stories. I had 11 drivers I was responsible for covering. I had radios. I could listen to the drivers, talk to the teams talk to the drivers. I could also hear the producer, the director, the play-by-play voice. I had a lot of things going on in my head that I had to filter out and listen for the good stories. And one of the drivers I was responsible for covering that day was Alexander Rossi. Remember, he's the rookie, 24 years old, only his 6th IndyCar race ever. And I figure, what are the odds I'm going to spend much time talking about him? After all, he is a rookie. Why did I possibly think he might be in a position to potentially win the race on the last lap with his inexperience? Now, I will tell you, I spent a lot of time talking with his team owner about what happened that day, why they were in a position to potentially win that race. And he makes it really clear that his organization has what he calls a communication culture, the ability for people to not just bring forth ideas, but bring forth ideas and be listened to. And it can't start the day of the race. the week of the race or the month of the race. It's got to be built into the organization. And these days, when communication is so difficult with so many remote workers, having that culture of communication is especially critical today. Let's talk about one of the most critical elements of communication. One of the reasons that, frankly, it's so hard. And to do it, I want to use Aristotle's 3 forms of persuasion. This goes back thousands of years. He came up with the 3 ways that people persuade others to do something. He called them logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos, of course, is using the logical argument. You know, it's facts, numbers, information, hopefully dispassionate. You lay them out on the table and people can see them, and that's what makes your case. Pathos, well, that's the personal appeal. You want somebody to do something because you may have a relationship and it would make a difference in your relationship, or because it may be the moral or right thing to do. And finally, there's ethos. Ethos is when you try to persuade somebody to do something based on their trust in you, in their trust in your credibility. And to be honest with you, I would argue that of these 3, ethos is the most important. Your trust and credibility are the key things that are going to make a difference in communication, because it doesn't matter how logical your argument is, it doesn't matter how many facts you have. If they don't trust you, they're not going to trust your facts. It doesn't matter what kind of personal appeal you have. If they don't think you're credible, they're not going to believe in your personal appeal. So what do you do when trust breaks down? Because inevitably in a workplace it happens over and over again. And it's even more complicated these days when you don't see people on a regular basis in the office. Well, I want to give you a tool. 4 simple letters, L, E, A, and F. LEAF stands for listen, empathize, acknowledge, and follow through. The first step is to listen. There's actually research that shows people are willing to forgive if they believe they were listened to. Your responsibility in rebuilding trust is to take that first step by listening to what the other person has to say, and then showing empathy, that you actually are touched by what they're saying. Not sympathy. Sympathy puts a distance between you and that other person. Empathy brings you closer together, that you empathize and you feel and you understand why they feel the way they do. You also have to acknowledge when something went wrong, you have to admit it. Now, it doesn't mean you necessarily have to apologize. It doesn't mean you have to take fault or blame for something that wasn't you, but you have to acknowledge that something may have gone wrong, even if it wasn't intended, and it's broken down that trust. And finally, you have to follow through. The way you rebuild trust is by saying, okay, that's where we've been, this is where we're going. You say you're going to do something, and then you do what you say you're going to do. You follow through to rebuild that trust and rebuild that credibility. One important step in improving your communication is understanding what kind of communicator you really are. Now, there's a simple quiz put together by a guy named Mark Murphy. It's only 13 questions. And when you finish, you get classified into one of 4 categories. You're either intuitive, analytical, functional, or personal. Now, intuitive communicators, that's me. I love to look on the horizon. I'm big picture. I'm capable of making gut-level decisions. Just don't bore me with all those numbers and details. Functional communicators, on the other hand, are the exact opposite. They love the numbers. They love all the details. They're not just going to show you the numbers. They're going to show you the math behind the numbers. They may bring in their calculus teacher from 12th grade to show you why the numbers work. And they drive intuitive people crazy. Intuitive people drive them crazy. And there's one important thing that I always like to leave people with, and that's this. You're only as good as your last communication. And when you think about it, there's always somebody that we have not communicated with the way we should. Somebody we owe an email or a phone call to, and maybe we're waiting because we don't have the information. But you think about it. It doesn't matter how well you communicated a week ago, a month ago, or a year ago, especially these days when communication has changed and now we can't see people in the hallways. We can't just accidentally bump into them in the lunchroom. You're only as good as your last communication. And while that may sound negative, it's also positive because it means you're just as good as your next communication. What I challenge people to do is when you leave this workshop, when you leave this presentation, to make a phone call, send an email, text message, Slack message, whatever it may be, to somebody you haven't talked with. Get back up on that horse, take control so you can reduce your stress and communicate more effectively.